Once you get fancy, fancy gets broken. Morgan Spurlock. In this episode, I'll cover a variety of lessons on bet sizing in poker, focusing on how it affects your strategy and your EV, along with the pros and cons of using more or less complex bet sizing schemes. I think that bet sizing is one of the biggest ways that online cash games are evolving right now, and that might be surprising for some people to hear. Now, we've already gone through a major shift around 2015 with the introduction of PioSolver, which really changed how we think about bet sizing. That change was obviously a lot more dramatic than what we're seeing today. Like, for example, when players started c-betting their entire range for a small size, that was a massive change in strategy that came with PioSolver. But in the last year or so, with the arrival of Ruse, which is now known as GTO Wizard AI since they acquired it, we've started to see some less obvious but still more important bet sizing improvements. Now, unlike older solvers, where you had to set your own bet sizes before you ran the sim, this one actually finds the best size for you, or the best sizes, depending on how many of them you want in your sim. And this makes it much easier to find the optimal size than what we had to do with older technology. So, for example, it might show you that c-betting 40% pot on the flop is, in some cases, actually substantially better than c-betting 30% pot. And these are the types of findings that would have taken a bit of work to discover using the older technologies, whereas now they're just sort of being handed to players who are using the software. And this is actually a pretty big shift, in my opinion, because although the edges that are being gained are small, it is changing the strategy, and even small edges do also add up when you apply them to very common nodes, or if you just apply them to many different nodes. So I thought it would be fun to do an episode on some bet sizing concepts. And while I don't plan to make a lot of episodes that are this heavy on poker theory, I do want to dive into the theory occasionally. So let's kick things off with the first lesson. And that is that allowing for more bet sizes generally means higher EV for your strategy. This applies to both pre-flop and post-flop, although we typically think about it more in terms of post-flop play. Now, think about why this might be the case. In fact, I actually challenge you to pause the podcast right now and come up with a simple reason for why adding bet sizes to your strategy would gain you more EV. So I'll give you a second to pause it. Now, my answer to that question is as follows. As you add more bet sizes to your strategy, you'll typically be able to squeeze out more value with combos that would have not been able to bet otherwise. Or you can win even more money with combos that would have been able to bet a larger amount. In other words, you can think of each combo in your range as kind of having an ideal bet size, a bet size that it would prefer to use. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, this comes down to a concept that I refer to as functionality. A functional value bet, by definition, gets weaker hands to call. A functional bluff gets stronger hands to fold. So, for example, if you only have a really large bet size that you can use, then you can imagine there are probably a lot of sort of marginal hands in your range that would like to bet, that could be called by weaker hands in your opponent's range, but can't, because if they bet that size, their opponent would just fold so much and would fold out all of the weaker hands than the hand that you're betting, and that would be a dysfunctional value bet. The broader concept here is just polarization. If you are making functional value bets and functional bluffs, that means you are polarizing your range properly. Let's take a quick break so I can tell you about my program, the Mobius GTO Stat Checker, which is now available for both MTTs and cash games. This program automatically compares your stats to solver data and pinpoints where you're off track, color-coding your stats to show you where you're too passive or too aggressive compared to GTO. You can also use this program to analyze your opponent's tendencies and exploit their mistakes. For example, you can easily figure out how often your pool is bluffing on the river, and therefore how often you should be bluff catching. Plus, it's great for evaluating the quality of your games. You can check the average win rate of the regulars in your pool, or see how many hands in your database were played by recreational players. The Mobius GTO Stat Checker takes the guesswork out of your study routine so you can focus on fixing your leaks and exploiting the leaks of your opponents. This course includes video modules to walk you through how to use the program and a support channel to make sure that you never get stuck. You can click the link in the show notes to learn more about the stat checker and purchase a copy for MTTs or cash games today. So adding sizes allows you to make more functional bets than you otherwise would be able to with less sizes. And another term that I use for this concept is tailored bet sizes. If you have the ability to really tailor your bet size to the exact strength of your hand, you'll be able to squeeze out more value, which means a higher overall EV for your strategy. And one other thing to note is that sort of hidden in my definition of this concept of functionality is that the EVs of each combo in your range depend on the other combos in your range and also your opponent's range, because you can't define what a functional value bet is or a dysfunctional value bet without taking into consideration the overall strength of your opponent's range. If you weaken your opponent's range, it's gonna become harder to make a dysfunctional value bet. If you strengthen your opponent's range, it's gonna become easier to do that. Okay, so why don't we just add as many bet sizes to our strategy as possible? Well, that is one strategy that you could take, but the downside is that adding more bet sizes will complicate your strategy, and it will also make it harder for you to achieve balance. So, for instance, one major risk of having too many bet sizes in your strategy is that you actually end up playing most of your hands pretty face up. Because if you just allow yourself to choose any size, it's fairly easy to just look at your hand and choose the bet size that makes the most sense for that hand. But then you forget about the times that you need to use a less intuitive bet size with that hand in order to balance your range for that bet sizing overall. To give a more specific example, I think a common case of this is when people make over bets, particularly on the flop or the turn, and it's very easy to see what types of value hands would go into that overbet size. And it's pretty easy to see what types of draws would go into that bet size, but it's not quite as easy to see what types of trash hands would go into that bet size. And that is something that solvers do. Even for the largest bet size, you will have quite a few zero equity bluffs in that range. And those are counterintuitive to hit. So if you do make this mistake, then the way your opponent could exploit you is just by massively overfolding anytime you size up a lot, because you're just telegraphing basically that you have it. It might not be obvious to you that you're missing bluffs when you choose this size, but if you looked at your behavior over a really large sample, you could see that, oh, in fact, you do fail to balance this size with enough bluffs. Another important point is that there are diminishing returns for adding more bet sizes after you've already added one or two. So choosing the correct single size will gain you the bulk of the EV, and then maybe choosing a second size on top of that will gain you a little bit more. But for each size you add, you're going to get less and less gains, but you're going to be increasing the complexity of your strategy more and more. And this might be a good time to mention that the actual amount of EV that you gain by choosing one bet size over another is very small in an absolute sense. I mean, we're talking about edges that are usually significantly less than 1% of the pot. However, poker is a game of very small edges, and even small edges do add up over time. I guess it just sort of depends on the level that you're playing poker at and the toughness of your games. Because if you're playing live or in really soft online environments, you're probably not going to care about adding a tenth of a big blind per 100 to your win rate with certain sizing upgrades. But certain players who are playing the toughest games in the world, or even just like mid-stakes players in relatively tough environments that are just looking to mine more edge, might be interested in doing this. But I do understand if you feel like that amount of edge is just insignificant to you. Maybe it is in your situation. But one more thing to consider is that when you use the correct bet size, that is what I would call an unassailable advantage. In other words, it just adds EV to your strategy and that is not EV that your opponent can take away or do anything about. On the flip side, using the incorrect size is an unforced error. You're just handing your opponent that EV. This is very different from being like unbalanced with your bet sizes. Because if you're under bluffing in a certain spot or over bluffing in a certain spot, that requires your opponent to actually counter exploit you in order to steal EV from you. Whereas an unforced error is more like double faulting your serve in tennis. It's just giving your opponent a point. And that's pretty important. And that's why I mentioned in the first episode of this podcast, the one about the bots on Ignition, I was talking about how a lot of bots will use many different sizes, even pre-flop, and they'll gain EV that way. And they can do that because they're bots, they're not humans. They don't have to worry about all of the complexity that results in. And that's a huge advantage. And we didn't even really mention how increasing complexity on your end of the game tree also increases the complexity on the defender's end of the game tree. Because if you're using 4 or 5 sizes in a particular node, then you're like, obviously you have to know how to balance all of those sizes and play them properly, but it also creates more opportunities for your opponent to mess up against you because your opponent has to know how to defend optimally versus all of those sizes. So the pros of adding more bet sizes is it can gain you EV, usually a small amount of EV, but still a significant amount, in my opinion. And it can also confuse your opponent because your opponent needs to know how to play against all these different sizes. But the cons of using more sizes is it explodes the complexity of your strategy. And this makes you more liable to make mistakes. It makes you more liable to burn out if you're playing a ton of volume. And it can also make you a lot more exploitable if you fail to balance these sizes properly. Real quick before I jump into the next lesson, if you're enjoying the show, please subscribe. I put a lot of effort into putting out these podcasts each week, and your support helps me keep going. Let's talk about a couple more bet size related concepts. First one is MDF, minimum defense frequency. Essentially, this just means that the larger you bet, the less your opponent needs to defend at GTO. So to give you a few examples, if you bet half pot on the river, then your opponent's minimum defense frequency is 67%. That is the amount that your opponent needs to defend in order to avoid you auto-profiting from your bluffs. So the sum of their call and raise frequencies against your bet needs to be 67%, and then they can fold the other third of the time. If you bet the full pot, then their minimum defense frequency drops to 50%, and they can fold half the time against that bet. If you double overbet, so you go 2x the pot, then their minimum defense frequency is only 33%, and they can fold 2/3 of the time. And so this is really the most important thing to think about whenever you're facing a bet is what is the size of the bet? Because that dictates how often you need to defend, and it simplifies your decision a lot because if you have a pretty strong hand and you're facing a very small bet, you know that you almost certainly have to defend that hand. If you are facing a huge bet and you don't have a very strong hand, you don't really even need to think about bluff catching with it because it's so likely that you have other hands in your range that are stronger that you can bluff catch with. Now, I'll just note that the concept of minimum defense frequency is sort of a simplified concept, and solvers don't strictly adhere to it. Sometimes they fold a lot more than the minimum defense frequency in certain spots. But if you want to read more about that, I would recommend going to my blog and looking at the article called The 3 Pillars of Poker Theory, and I'll link that in the show notes. The next concept, which is pretty related, is optimal bluffing frequency. So this is when you're betting, your bluffing frequency needs to go up as your bet size goes up. And this just basically has to do with the odds that you're offering your opponent to call. If you bet larger, you're offering your opponent worse odds to call. And so you have to sort of sweeten the deal by bluffing more. At least that's one way that you could look at it. So for example, if you bet half pot on the river, your optimal bluffing frequency is only 25%. Since you're offering your opponent 3-to-1 odds to call your bet, you can only bluff 1/4 of the time. On the other hand, if you bet 2x the pot, then your optimal bluffing frequency goes up to 40%. But what happens after that is kind of interesting because from half pot to 2x, we went from 25% bluffing frequency to 40. But if you go from 2x pot to 4x pot, the optimal bluffing frequency only increases another 4% from 40% to 44%. And that is because it's impossible to ever offer your opponent 1-to-1 odds on a bet. And that's why you get what is known as an asymptotic relationship, where it approaches a limit but never actually gets to that limit. And so the takeaway there is basically just that your opponent needs to adjust their bluffing frequency quite a bit as they go from a small size to sizes equal or greater than pot. But as you start to get to really big overbets, it might be natural to assume that they need to be bluffing more and more and more. But actually, the amount that they need to bluff for the really big overbets kind of levels off, especially after you get to 2 to 3x the pot. The optimal bluffing frequency for sizes 2x pot or larger are actually pretty similar. The final thing that I'll talk about is errors versus small bet sizes compared to errors versus large bet sizes. So versus small bet sizes, the errors your opponents can make are usually less severe, but they will be more common. On the other hand, errors versus large bet sizes are going to be less common, but when they do happen, they'll be more severe in an EV sense. So for example, if you're facing a huge bet on the river, it's usually fairly easy to get the right answer if you're bluff catching. I mean, you just fold a lot. But if you do make a mistake against that size and you call a hand that you're supposed to fold with perhaps really bad blockers, or you just call a hand that is way too weak to call in that spot, that's when you start to see EVs in the solver of like -5 big blinds or -10 big blinds. It's possible when you're facing a really big bet size to make really big mistakes. If you're facing a small bet size, it is still possible to make a big mistake if you just fold a hand that is way too strong to fold against that size. But usually what happens is you will make more mistakes but less severe mistakes. And because you have to defend so much more and you have to raise so much more typically versus small sizes, it's easier to just fold a little bit too much, maybe not raise enough. And these mistakes are going to be close to indifferent usually, but there are going to be more of them. So you can sort of pick your poison. You can attack your opponent with smaller bet sizes and have more of a gradual stream of EV coming your way when your opponent makes mistakes versus those. Or you can attack him with huge bet sizes, and he might not make a mistake frequently, but when he does, that's going to be a lot of EV headed your direction. And of course, it's the same on the flip side. If you are using a very small bet size, it's typically hard to make a huge polarization error with a small bet size. And as you get to extremely small bet sizes like 10% pot, I mean, that's effectively the same as checking almost. So unless you are like in position on the river and you just bet way too small, you're not going to find a lot of really big mistakes with a small size. However, it is much easier to make a huge mistake with a large bet size if you make a big polarization error with it, if you make a really dysfunctional bet, going back to that concept that I was speaking about in the beginning. Another little math fact related to this is that a 1% overfold versus a small bet size is not the same in terms of exploitability as a 1% overfold versus a large bet size, like a big overbet. If you overfold by 1% versus a huge overbet, you're much more exploitable than overfolding by 1% versus a very small bet. And again, check out that article, The 3 Pillars of Poker Theory, if you want to see a more extensive explanation of that. So that wraps up my lessons on bet sizing. What are the key takeaways? The takeaways are that generally adding more sizes allows you to tailor your bet sizes more effectively and gains more EV for your overall strategy. This can also be a good thing if it confuses your opponent, if you're using sizes that they're not well studied against. The downside is that adding more bet sizes can explode the complexity of your strategy and can really make you spin out. It can also lead to unforced errors if you're just using the wrong size for your specific combo. And it can also make you more exploitable if allowing yourself to tailor your bet sizes results in you just playing your hand pretty face up. My recommendation is typically to try to use one size up until the river. And when I say one size, what I mean is that you can use different sizes in the same line, but you never split your range across two sizes in the exact same scenario. So when you're c-betting the flop, you might use 30% on one texture and 70% on another, but you try to limit this and you never split your range across multiple sizes on the same texture. Then once you get to the river, you can start splitting your range into two sizes, maybe three sizes, and that is going to yield the vast majority of the EV without causing you to spin out due to the complexity of your strategy. And I would only recommend intentionally making your strategy with bet sizes more complicated to try to confuse your opponents, only if you are already sort of crushing poker. But if you can't play a single size correctly, then you definitely shouldn't be trying to play multiple sizes. That's it for this episode. Be sure to subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you on the next one. Good luck at the tables.